Welcome to APA's second Town Hall of 2021. My name is Billy Zydick, Manager of Special Projects for APA. Allow me to review a couple of housekeeping items before we start. All attendees are in listen-only mode. We ask that you utilize the chat box for the Q&A segment of the session. While we attempt to respond to all questions submitted, should we run out of time, responses will be posted to APA's COVID-19 RAQ Recently Asked Questions webpage. We also remind participants to ensure their speaker volume level is set for your comfort. Our speakers are gathering us from across the continent, and as such, varying volumes will be present. Today's session will award professional continuing education credits, as well as APA credentialing points and AIA CLUs. For AIA certificates, please email Billy at billie@apa.org, along with your AIA membership number if you have not done so in the past. Our webinar recording will be posted to APA's website later this afternoon. Additionally, you will receive a follow-up email within 72 hours providing designated links to all webinar recordings, presentation slides, as well as information on upcoming webinars and town halls. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Lander Medlin, APA's Executive Vice President, for your moderator today. Lander, take it away.
Welcome, all attendees. We really appreciate your engagement in these town hall meetings as we further explore the impact of COVID-19 on our facilities organizations and the education enterprise. I would like to recognize Black History Month and affirm our community's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So important. As a quick reminder, our next town hall will occur Friday, February 19, 2021, with a different target and focus on considering the remote hybrid campus workplace. As always, thank you for joining the dialogue. That's what makes this a rich conversation and the special community we share. As schools are reopening for the spring semester, the economic fallout from COVID is real. Higher education's financial and budgetary uncertainties from enrollment volatility, fluctuations in state funding, auxiliary support and athletics losses, and COVID-related expenses have taken their toll. That's why we chose this topic today, the campus COVID economy, a focus on institutional revenues and expenses. It's also why we chose one particular expert who has the knowledge, understanding, and thoughtful perspective on the pressing issues we are experiencing in higher education and what portends for the coming year. As such, here's the format for today's town hall. I'll provide an introduction to set the past month's context, recognize our stellar expert, provide an opportunity for your questions, and conclude by highlighting additional resources and closing remarks. As much as we'd love to leave 2020 behind, the effects of the pandemic, the economic crisis, racial justice, and our environmental disasters still very much affect all of us. The pandemic is a long way from being over. So in 2021, our health matters more than ever. We are still facing a global health crisis that has taken the lives of more than 450,000 people in the US, 20% of the global toll, and nearly 2.3 million worldwide. Recognize it took more than 9 months for the world to pass 1 million deaths in late September. Yet in just a little over 3 months, the virus had claimed another 1 million lives. Now, US COVID cases total 26.7 million, or 25% of the cases globally. As big as these case numbers are today, the number of new cases in the US are finally tiptoeing in the right direction. They continued to decline yesterday to a daily average of 146,000 cases over the past 7 days, and indeed the past 3 weeks. That's down as much as 42% from the peak in early January. Yet we must be cautious, as this could quite possibly ramp up quickly with the coming Super Bowl parties and new variants, virus mutations from the UK, South Africa, and Brazil. Understand, the science behind masks is well documented. President Biden implemented a national mask mandate on federal property and public transportation systems that is now in effect. Biden also asked the public to take the Wear a Mask challenge for his first 100 days. Plus, double masking for COVID-19 protection is a trend with a purpose. We have the collective power to put a stop to the spread of this virus by obeying the public health guidance of the 3 W's, where double masks, wash your hands, watch your distance, and avoid crowded settings or gatherings, especially indoors. And with these new variants, we must box in the virus through strategic testing, rapid contact tracing, supportive of quarantine, and effective isolation. Getting vaccinated plus implementing these multi-layered mitigation strategies are the most effective measures for decreasing the risk of transmission. Remember, 59% of all virus transmission comes from asymptomatic individuals. We must reinvigorate the cause to mitigate with these existing strategies. Collectively, we can shape what happens over the next few months and demonstrate we really are in this together. And we need to do so. The mutation-laden variants are on the move. They are here. They are scary given the dramatic infection transmission rates, 70% greater, by the way. That's a game changer. With January the deadliest month yet, mutating viruses and vaccine progress will define February. The vaccine news continues to be better than many people realize. First, vaccinations are fundamental to slowing transmission and especially essential workers. 5 vaccines are expected to become part of our viral defense arsenal over the next few months. They are Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Novavax, and Johnson & Johnson, boasting a range of effectiveness, but all look extremely good and all help prevent severe illness, which means keeping people out of the hospital and keeping them alive. Here's the key fact. All 5 vaccines with public results have eliminated COVID-19 deaths and also drastically reduced hospitalizations. That's great news. And any vaccine that helps people from getting seriously ill and not dying is truly a game changer. Everyone should get vaccinated. Unfortunately, the vaccine's distribution administration is still disaggregated and dysfunctional, with only 36% of doses sent to the U.S. states utilized. Ramping up production to increase availability remains critical. A national strategy for vaccine rollout cannot come soon enough. Now, the CDC continues its focus on sequencing coronavirus genomes to identify and isolate new mutations. U.S. doctors are now recommending pregnant women get vaccinated. The U.S. economy shrank in 2020 despite fourth quarter growth. New jobless claims, a proxy for layoffs, declined slightly for a 3rd straight week, which is good, totaling 779,000 people. But many of the lost jobs are unlikely to return, leaving millions of people unemployed. And the U.S. only added 49,000 jobs in January. It's a pretty weak showing. Congress seems poised to pass yet another stimulus package, but only time will tell whether these efforts will be successful. Consumer spending and retail sales fell in December as COVID cases rose. Federal Reserve held policy steady as the economy stumbles. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, the U.S. economy is expected to return to its pre-pandemic size by mid-2021. Now, their brightening outlook was a result of large sectors of the economy adapting better and more rapidly to the pandemic than originally expected. The December 2020 $900 billion economic aid package was also reflected in the CBO's increased growth expectation. Now for higher ed. Just earlier this week, a third of the 3,000 higher education institutions included in the Chronicle's Spring Campus Reopening Tracker are categorized as undetermined or other. Yep, you heard it. That's largely because many institutions either have delayed in-person starts or have yet to commit to a plan for navigating yet another tricky semester of pandemic learning. Despite all of the uncertainty, the trend is more toward more in-person learning than in the fall. There are a lot of pressures for institutions to show that they are in person. The push to return to face-to-face learning is real, some financial, some political, but all to show that they are in person in some way or another. Now, all eyes are on fall 2021 enrollments. While the volume of applications overall is up 10% from a year ago, there are other more troubling trends beneath this top-line number. For example, the number of first-generation applicants is down 3% from the point a year ago. The number of students who requested fee waivers for their applications also fell by 2%. And it's clear that the pandemic is continuing to have equity implications for higher education, especially with the first-time freshman decline of 13% we experienced this past fall, and the sharp drops among first-time Black, Hispanic, and Native American students in particular. These students, who we need to woo to our campuses to make up enrollment declines, will need additional support in the months ahead. We must reach out to them. Plus, fewer high school students nationally are completing aid applications through FAFSA, which suggests many students aren't on track to go to college. Then there's the decline by several percentage points of the smaller rural and regional public institutions' applications as compared to last year. This is all very disturbing. Now, even though international student enrollment was dropping pre-pandemic, there is a surge in international applicants for fall, except China. We also expect graduate enrollment will keep growing. So community colleges should do better than fall. But boy, that 18.3% drop this past fall, But a rapidly reopening economy might convince prospects to grab as many work hours as they can and put off college for another day. It's a concern. It's the same dilemma that will impact adult undergraduate enrollment at four-year schools. So let's keep all this in mind as we're approaching the fall. Now, today we have an awesome opportunity to hear from my distinguished colleague from ACE, the American Council on Education, who will cover ground on both the broader issues shaping public perception of higher education and the impact of COVID-related lost revenues and added expenses, along with the latest on the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, lovingly dubbed as CRRSAA. Now that you're up to speed with the latest background and context, let me introduce our expert. Terry W. Hartle, Senior Vice President, Government and Public Affairs, American Council on Education. Terry is one of America's most effective and experienced advocates for higher education. At ACE, where he has served for more than 25 years, he directs comprehensive efforts to engage federal policymakers on a broad range of issues, including student aid, government regulation, scientific research, and tax policy. His work involves representation before the U.S. Congress, administrative agencies, and the federal courts. As an expert voice on behalf of colleges and universities, he is quoted widely in the national and international media on higher education issues. Given ACE's historic role in coordinating the government relations efforts of some 60 associations in the Washington-based higher education community, Hartle plays a central part in developing public policy positions that impact all colleges and universities, and also oversees the Council's external relations functions. By the way, in 2021, Hartle and the ACE Government and Public Affairs team received the Outstanding Service to Higher Education Award from NASPA, our Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, in recognition of their public policy advocacy on behalf of the entire higher education community, particularly in response to the crisis the pandemic has posed for institutions and students. Prior to joining the Council in 1993, Hartle served for 6 years as Education Staff Director for the Senate Committee on Labor and Human Resources, then chaired by Senator Edward M. Kennedy. Prior to 1987, he was Director of Social Policy Studies and Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a research scientist at the Educational Testing Service. Hartle has authored or co-authored numerous articles, books, and national studies, and contributes regular book reviews to the Christian Science Monitor. He is a member of the Smith College Board of Trustees. Hartle received a doctorate in public policy from the George Washington University, GWU, a master's in public administration from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, and a bachelor's degree in history, summa cum laude, from Hiram College. He was awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree by Northeastern University. He has received the GWU President's Medal, the Hiram College Alumni Achievement Award, and has been inducted into the Hiram College Athletic Hall of Fame. He is a member of the Phi Beta Kappa. Terry, you have been hard at work, and we have known each other forever. So please, Terry, take this over.
Well, thanks very much, Lander, for that kind and overly generous introduction. Whenever anybody introduces me with praise like that, I think I should probably just say something like, okay, I'm done. Any questions? Lest I make a presentation that people wonder what all the fuss was about. But assuming I can't get away with that, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the public policy arena. I thought, Lander, you gave a very nice job of summarizing sort of where the country is with the pandemic, the good news and the bad news. Good news is the number of cases are going down. Good news is vaccine is being rolled out, not as fast as anybody would like, but pretty well. Bad news is that we have some variants that are pretty troubling and could still cause great problems for us before we get widespread distribution of the vaccine. So we have good news and some bad news. But let me start really with talking about what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now. As you all know, we have a new administration. We have a new Congress, and they're moving pretty quickly to try and enact some legislation. The executive branch, the administration's moving pretty quickly to try and undo some things that the previous administration put in place. So it's not only a time of economic uncertainty, of public health uncertainty, but there are a lot of changes in the public policy arena as well. And because colleges and universities and our students depend so much on federal support, what the federal government does or doesn't do will have a massive effect on our campuses. Let me start with some contextual considerations here. First, the Democrats now have control of both houses on Capitol Hill. First time since 2009, 2010 that was the case. But the Democrats don't have control by very much. The Democrats have a margin of 5 seats in the House and a margin of 0 seats in the Senate. In 2009, 2010, in the Obama administration, when they last had control, they had a margin of 70 seats in the House and 10 seats in the Senate. If you don't have a significant margin, it means you have to get all of your members to line up and agree with the direction that you are going in. So in the Senate, for example, this means that Joe Manchin, John Tester, Elizabeth Warren, and Bernie Sanders all have to agree on what's going to go into a particular piece of legislation. In the House, they have a margin of 5, but that's really not very much when you're dealing with 435 members in total. So they have control, but not control that really enables them to do things as much as they would like. Second thing to underscore is that things take time. Americans are impatient people. We believe that if we change the government in Washington, significant change will come about right away. It doesn't work that way. It will take a while for the new administration to get its people in place. Give you an example, there are 1,250 presidentially appointed Senate confirmed positions in the federal government. So far, 40 people have been nominated, 6 people have been confirmed. It'll be the middle of the summer before the Biden administration has all of their people in place across all of the agencies. The legislative process always takes time, and particularly the case, I think, when Congress is so narrowly divided in partisan terms. Third consideration, bipartisanship versus partisanship. President Biden, by nature of his experience and temperament, is a very bipartisan sort of guy. He's going to want to find common ground as much as is possible, and he's made clear he will reach out to the Republicans to encourage them to work with him to address the nation's public policy concerns. Having said that, bipartisanship is not simply a one-way street. President Biden can't on his own ensure that there will be bipartisanship because the Republicans have to be willing to go along. So the other pressure here is partisanship. And the Democrats are acutely aware of a lesson that the Obama administration learned in 2009 and 2010. President Obama also entered office greatly committed to bipartisanship and expressed a deep willingness to work with the Republicans in the House and Senate to get things done, even though President Obama had such a big margin that he pretty well could have done whatever he wanted without Republican support. The experience that the Democrats had was that Republicans talked about bipartisanship, but there was never a way to get to it with them. They would never reach a position on any of the major pieces of legislation that the Obama administration was trying to enact. All it did was, frankly, slow down the public policy process, and it delayed the ability of the Obama administration to get their policies and procedures in place. In part because of this, Democrats believe the Democrats took a pasting in the midterm elections in 2010. They lost control of the House, they lost control of the Senate. Looking back on it, I think there were a couple of explanations for it, but certainly one of them was it took the Democrats a very long time to get their economic stimulus / recovery plan in place. Democrats are determined not to repeat that mistake this time. So what you're hearing in Washington, despite the Biden administration saying we want bipartisanship, is you're seeing Democrats in the House and Senate move very rapidly to enact President Biden's proposed American Recovery Act, and I'll talk about that in another minute. Next slide, please. Pandemic and economic stimulus, these are the big issues for the Biden administration. Again, there's a parallel here with the Obama administration. If you recall back to 2009, President Obama took office at a time of great economic crisis. He didn't cause it, he absolutely inherited it. And President Biden finds himself facing a public health catastrophe and a serious economic problem. He's got two dimensions to worry about here. The fact of the matter is that after 6 months, by July 4th, 2009, President Obama owned the economic recovery. By July 4th, 2021, President Biden will own the pandemic and the economic recovery. The biggest consideration in President Biden's midterm elections, which are always sort of a referendum on the party in power, is how well the nation is moving past the pandemic and whether or not the economy is growing. The Biden administration believes that above everything else, they have to ensure that they've got the pandemic completely under control and that the economy is growing at a healthy rate. Because Congress is so closely divided, there will be a priority on executive branch actions. There will also be a priority on executive branch actions because so much of what the Trump administration put in place was done through the executive branch. If you put new policies and requirements in place through the executive branch, it's pretty easy to get it done, but the next administration can toss out what you accomplished. This is what we saw when the Trump administration took over for the Obama administration. It is what we are seeing now with the Biden administration. So far, President Biden has issued about 35 executive orders, many of these simply repealing executive orders that President Trump had put in place. Now, for example, President Trump put in place an executive order dealing with race and gender stereotyping that limited the ability of federal contractors, which includes most colleges and universities, to conduct diversity training programs on campus or in their workplace. The Biden administration simply struck it off. The Biden administration put in place something called the Muslim travel ban. The Trump administration put that in place. Biden administration has already struck it. So the Biden administration is moving very quickly through executive branch actions. But again, executive branch changes are not necessarily permanent. Real lasting permanent change only comes from changing laws, and that requires Congress to go along. Another issue just to tee up for you here is that a lot of the things that are of concern to colleges and universities as the Biden administration takes charge deal with executive branch actions, regulatory actions that were put in place under the Trump administration. We've actually compiled a list of things that we think are contrary to the interests of our students and our institutions, and we've asked the Biden administration to consider revising, rewriting, or striking them. This, again, it's going to take time, but a lot of what we will see from the Biden administration will be on the executive branch front. Next slide, please. The Biden-Harris folks have a multifaceted human capital investment agenda. Much of this, of course, deals with higher education. And I'll talk about 5 different parts of it. The first one is the COVID-19 relief. Congress has passed several pieces of legislation designed to address the pandemic and to provide economic relief to individuals and businesses that have been hammered by the pandemic and economic downturn. Again, as I mentioned earlier, getting control of the pandemic, getting the economy growing is job 1, job 2, and job 3 for the Biden administration. Not surprisingly, they're moving very rapidly to try to enact another economic stimulus package and health care package. The process they're going to use is fairly complicated, but it has the advantage of allowing them to get something enacted that can't be filibustered in the Senate. Remember, in the Senate, the general rule is that you need 60 votes to get something done. 41 members of the Senate can, if they choose, pretty much block the Senate from thinking about anything. Obviously, the Republicans have 50 seats in the Senate, so they've got more than enough members to throw sand into the public policy machinery. The big exception here is a public policy device called reconciliation. This simply allows Congress to pass legislation on a straight majority vote, including in the Senate, without any opportunity for a filibuster in the Senate. It simply limits the amount of time that can be spent discussing a piece of legislation, and then it says you only need 51 votes. This is what's underway in Washington right now to put in place the $1.9 trillion spending package called the American Recovery Act. Here's roughly how it works. To do reconciliation, both the House and Senate have to pass something, majority vote, called a budget resolution. A budget resolution sort of sets the parameters for spending. It says this is what we, Congress, are going to do. Budget resolution isn't signed by the president. It is not a law. It's simply Congress tying its own hands. The House and Senate this week have both passed budget resolutions. Basically, the budget resolution says we are going to put in place the elements of the American Economic Recovery Plan that President Biden has outlined. The next step following the budget resolution is that the various committees in Congress that have responsibilities or oversight of the agencies involved in the American Recovery Plan will write legislation to make the changes that President Biden has called for. This is the reconciliation process. First, the House will do it, and then the Senate will do it. After both chambers have done it, they will sit down in a conference, and they will resolve any differences that exist between them. Reconciliation is pretty straightforward in the House because the House rules strictly on a basis of majority vote. Democrats are strongly committed to this. They understand the importance of getting control of the pandemic and getting the economy growing. So reconciliation is relatively straightforward in the House. The House committees will begin to write the legislation next week to put this in place. In all likelihood, by the 19th of the month, a couple of weeks from today, the House will have completed its work on reconciliation at the committee level. All these committees that write this stuff give their proposals to the Budget Committee. The House Budget Committee packages them, and takes them to the full House for a vote. Similar process in the Senate. Senate committees are given instructions. Senate committees have a couple of weeks to write the legislation to accomplish this. The individual pieces are given to the Senate Budget Committee. Senate Budget Committee assembles them into a package, and that package goes to the Senate floor, subject only to a 50-vote margin and 20 hours of debate. This is designed to make it possible to get stuff done. The Senate's going to be on a slightly slower schedule than the House because the Senate next week will take up President Trump's second impeachment. When the Senate is doing impeachment, they don't do anything else. So all the work on reconciliation is going to be frozen until they finish with the impeachment inquiry. So the next couple of weeks, you'll hear a lot about legislation being written in the House that would provide money to lots of different things that are part of the American Recovery Plan. You'll hear a lot about an impeachment trial in the Senate. You won't hear much about legislation in the Senate. You'll hear about the Senate in another couple of weeks. The goal here is to get the House and Senate to pass their bills, to conference the bills and resolve any differences, and to get the final bill to the president by mid-March. Mid-March is important because mid-March is when the when the unemployment insurance benefits expire. Remember, we've expanded unemployment insurance as a result of the economic downturn. That expires middle of March. So that's what you're going to be hearing a lot about in the next 6 weeks, 2 months in Washington, D.C. Budget resolutions are done. Reconciliation packages have to be created, and they have to be assembled, and they have to be passed. This is very likely to happen. The news for higher education is that the President's Economic Recovery Plan proposed spending $35 billion on higher education. This is money that would be given directly to campuses to be distributed to students and for use by the institution, similar to the way that previous tranches of money have been distributed to institutions. So we think we're looking at about $35 billion for colleges and universities, but of course, nobody knows for sure because we haven't seen the legislation yet and nothing has been voted on. COVID-19 relief, that's the first, second, and third thing, as I've said, on the Biden-Harris higher education agenda. 4 other things that the Biden-Harris team talked about during the election campaign. First, they talked about increasing funding for historically Black colleges and universities. This is a relatively straightforward matter. Congress simply has to agree to put more money into the programs that currently fund historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, and Hispanic serving institutions. These are popular programs. I believe that Congress will agree to put more money into those programs as part of the fiscal year 2022 budget process. So people might not see the money until sometime this fall, but I think this is a straightforward proposition. Another thing that the Biden-Harris team talked about that is also straightforward in that new authorizing legislation is not required, the programs already exist, is they said they wanted to double funding for the Pell Grant program. Pell Grant provides grants to low-income first-generation college students. It's a very popular program. It's a voucher. Money goes directly to the families, and the families decide where to spend it. It overwhelmingly goes to low-income families. This is a little trickier than funding for HBCUs because doubling the maximum Pell Grant will cost about $30 billion a year. It's not a cheap step to take. It's not a hard step. The authority to make the money available already exists. Congress could provide the money and students and families could have it in the fall. But $30 billion a year means it's $300 billion over 10 years. And that's probably a big enough amount of money that it's going to be controversial. Third thing that the Biden team talked about during the election campaign was some sort of generalized student loan forgiveness. In other words, for the 40 million borrowers that owe money to the federal government for student loans, a certain amount of that debt would simply be forgiven. Some people have suggested forgiving $10,000 in debt for every borrower. Others, including Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, have suggested forgiving $50,000 in debt for every borrower who owes money to the federal government. There are two issues with respect to student loan forgiveness. First issue is that it's very expensive. Just forgiving $10,000 in debt for every borrower currently repaying their student loan would cost $350 billion in the first year, so more than the cost of doubling the Pell Grant program. Second complexity on student loan forgiveness is whether or not Congress needs to pass separate legislation to enable the Biden administration to do this. Many Democrats, particularly progressives, believe that the executive branch has unilateral authority already to waive student loan debt. The Biden administration has made clear that they don't think they have the authority to simply forgive student loan debt, and that they will require legislation to be passed by Congress before they can do it. Biden administration yesterday said, we're going to take another look at this, but this is a big, expensive, likely controversial step, because much of the benefit will go to people who have borrowed a lot of money to attend graduate and professional schools and who have pretty good jobs. Final thing that the Biden-Harris team talked about during the campaign was some sort of a free college plan. Initially, as a candidate for the Democratic nomination, Joe Biden said he wanted free community college. As the campaign season moved along, he got to free public higher education for everybody making less than $125,000. Obviously, this is potentially very problematic for private colleges and universities. I think that this is the least likely thing that will happen. It is expensive, it is complex, and there are obvious political challenges if half the nation's colleges, that is to say private colleges, are excluded. So this was on their wish list. I think particularly given the narrowly divided political situation on Capitol Hill, that this is very unlikely to happen. Next slide, please. Higher education regulatory agenda. I just sort of put this on here because I wanted you to see the huge range of things that the Department of Education and other federal agencies are going to be involved with. Title IX, these are the regulations dealing with sexual assault. The Biden administration will certainly move to kill the Trump administration's Title IX regulations, but they can't just kill it, they have to replace it. This is very complicated. It will probably take them 2 years to replace the Title IX regulations. Other regulations, gainful employment, borrower defense. The Obama administration put one set of regulations in place. Trump administration withdrew those regulations. Biden administration will now withdraw the Trump regulations and put something like the Obama regulations back in place. But again, a regulatory process takes time. It's probably 2 years before we see this happen. A politically motivated investigation, particularly in the last year of the Trump administration, they began investigating individual institutions for things that the Department of Education and the Department of Justice felt that the schools had done wrong. It appeared to many that these were politically motivated. It's widely hoped that these politically motivated investigations will be terminated. Just this week, the Justice Department announced that they were terminating an investigation of use of race in admissions at Yale. for example. There are a couple of others of these that are around, and we hope that they will go away too. This is not to defend any school that's doing anything wrong. It's simply to say politically motivated investigations probably shouldn't be pursued. Foreign gift reporting, another area of complexity. We're hoping the Biden administration will provide some more clarity on college university responsibilities. And of course, an issue that Lander touched on, foreign students, immigration, visas, foreign scholars. Over the last 4 years, the Trump administration took about 400 separately identifiable executive branch actions that dealt with this constellation of issue. Very little of it, frankly, was aimed at foreign students, but there was an awful lot of collateral damage. And so we think that the Biden administration is going to move pretty aggressively to try and replace some of these executive branch actions. But when you've got 400 separate things to deal with, it's going to take time. Next slide, please. I thought that one way to sort of give you some food for thought, because you don't need to worry too much about the day-to-day machinations of Congress and what's going on Capitol Hill. It's obviously important to our institutions, but it's not the sort of thing that many of you deal with on a day-to-day basis. But I thought, having talked about sort of where we are right now in the Washington public policy arena, I'd talk about 4 overarching concerns that I have about higher education in the public square. What the public thinks about higher education, what the public knows about higher education, what motivates the public policy discussion and the political toxicity that we're living in at the present time. And I'm going to mention 4 separate things. First, economic growth. Second, I want to talk about the partisan perceptions of colleges and universities. Third, something any of you at a public university are all too familiar with, that's public funding going down and tuition and fees going up. And finally, I want to show you why the public is so concerned about student debt to pay for college and why it's something that we need to be aware of. So economy, partisan, states, student debt. Let's go to the first slide. This slide shows you what's happened in the United States over the last 30 years. It goes from 1990 to 2020. The red line shows the change in median household income over a generation. In real terms, it's gone from $57,000 to $68,700. That's a gain of 21% in real terms. But look at that black line. Black line shows you what's happened to GDP, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product in the United States over the last generation has doubled. The United States is a much wealthier country than it was in 1990. But the median household, most households aren't seeing that increased wealth. They're very little better off than they were a generation ago. Obviously, we talk a lot about the top 5% of earners, the top 10% of earners, and they have done very, very, very well. The average family, not so much. And I think a lot of the unhappiness, the dismay, the political controversy, the bitterness can be explained by this chart. This isn't something that higher education can fix. But we are becoming 2 very different societies. And I think this does give you some insight into why so many of our fellow citizens are embittered at what they see as their state, their status in the United States at the present time. Next slide, please. Higher education has always benefited by being seen as a positive good by Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And this is very important because what goes on college campuses depends heavily on the widespread acceptance by all parts of American society. So therefore, there's some concern as we see Republican support for higher education falling away. This was something done by the Pew Research Center in 2018. And you notice the blue line are Democrats, shows their support is stable. If anything, over the last decade, it's increased a little bit. But look at what's happened to perceptions of higher education among Republicans. It's dropped from 58% having positive perceptions to 36%. I think Americans have always believed that higher education tilted somewhat to the left. You know, in the Depression, a common joke among conservatives was to ask one another, how do you get to Washington? And the answer was you go to Harvard and turn left. And certainly at various points in our history, think the McCarthy era, think the student protests in the 1960s, colleges and universities have seemed to be left-leaning to Americans. But nonetheless, until the last few years, most Americans thought it was sort of within the bounds of reasonableness. Most people thought, well, okay, maybe, but it's not a big deal. This chart suggests very clearly to me that one important part of the country, Republicans, increasingly think that that perception is a big deal. Because if we lose support among both political parties, we become just one more element in the partisan warfare that's really tearing colleges and universities apart. Republicans believe, with some justification, that their views are not welcome on college and university campuses, that their voices are shut aside. Republicans believe that colleges and universities are not interested in their constituents as much as they should be. As I've said, I think there's some validity to these charges, and I think they're also significantly overblown. But that's the world that we live in. In 2021, Americans are pretty tribal. We look at organizations, we look at industries, and we ask ourselves, are these people on my side or are they not on my side? Are these organizations working in my interest and my family's, or are they working on behalf of somebody else? And I think the situation we are in is that Republicans are increasingly assigning higher education to the other side. And I think that's very dangerous for the long-term well-being of our institutions. The next slide bears on this point too, if we could go there. This is just simply the perception of people who say that colleges and universities are open to different viewpoints. Democrats overwhelmingly think colleges and universities are open to different viewpoints. But Republicans have a very different perception. 68%, that's a pretty good number. That's not bad, but it's a very different temperature if you're talking to Republicans or Democrats. And I think I think, as I've said, that's quite worrisome. Let's go to the next slide, if we could. This slide will show you something that really comes as no surprise to anybody at a public college or university. Once again, looking at trends in funding higher education for a generation. It goes back to 1990. The issue here, again, as anyone at a public university knows, is that states have been cutting operational support for colleges and universities and letting tuition and fees go up to make up the difference. This chart gives you some idea of what that looks like when we put it on a single graph. State funding has fallen about 4% in real term over the last 30 years, but funding coming from tuition is up almost 180%. Community colleges, increase in tuition and fees has been about 108%. Obviously, that's still outpacing change in family income. So if you look at this and you think about what's happened to family economic status over the last generation, a lot of Americans look at higher education and think, you know, this is important. I'd like my kids to have it, but the price of it is running away from me. My income's not going up as the price of a college education. College is essential for many careers, many occupations if you're to have a good job. And I think it instills a sense of fear, anger, unhappiness, and bitterness. But this chart points out what's happening in the public sector. Remember, only about half of all college universities are public institutions, but about 80% of enrollment is in public institutions. Arguably, the biggest determinant of the price that most families pay for college is the decision that their state government is going to make about funding higher education. Because of the devastation that the pandemic is wreaking on college and on state budgets, I fear that these numbers are going to continue to move in a very undesirable direction. Let's go to the next chart, please. Final chart. You hear a lot about student debt. You hear a lot about students borrowing too much money to pay for college. Students can't get jobs to pay off their student loans. This is a lot of what's driving the discussion, particularly among Democrats, about student loan forgiveness. What this chart does, and we could only do it for a decade because data wasn't available, but it combines three different numbers for you to see this. Since 2010, between 2010 and 2019, which was the last year I could get the data for, the salary paid to recent college graduates has gone up by 1% in real terms. 1% gain in the salary paid to college graduates with a BA. The growth in median household income over that time is about 3%. So again, this pattern, not very much income growth. Over that same time period, 2010 to 2020 in this case, price of college up 17% in real terms. When I say college prices, this is public and private college tuition enrollment weighted. It goes up overall at 17%. Public goes up a little faster than that. Private goes up a little slower. But it gives you some idea of the difference between salaries and college prices. So people look at it and say, you know, the price of a college education is going up a lot faster than my income, an issue I mentioned before. Student debt has gone up a great deal over the last decade. According to this, the average debt of students who borrow to go to college has increased by 67% in a decade. 67% in real terms in a decade. So even if we could accept the small increase in income for recent graduates and median household incomes versus the 17% gain in college prices, look what's happening to average debt. Debt is going crazy. Part of what this chart says is that people are borrowing for consumption as much as they are for the price of higher education. If they were just borrowing to cover their college costs, you would expect that blue line to be about where that silver line is, that there'd be some relationship. But the fact that it's going up so much faster is an indication to many of us that students and families are borrowing some money, at least some of their money, for consumption purposes. But as long as their salaries aren't increasing and their average indebtedness is, they're facing huge challenges when it comes to paying for their loans. In economics, Stein's law holds that something that can't continue indefinitely won't. This cannot go on forever. This simply will not continue indefinitely. But it's where we've been over the last 10 years. And I think this, more than anything, explains public concerns about the value, that is the economic return of a college education, and public concerns about the level of debt that people incur if they want to pursue a college education. Next slide, Lander. I think this brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope that was of interest to the many people who have joined us on the line. I thank everybody for being here. If there is time and opportunity to do questions, to have comments, to trade jokes, I'd be happy to do all of those things. So thanks again for having me, and look forward to any discussion that we're able to have.
Absolutely, Terry. And we do have questions that have come in while you were talking about the various issues. And I'll go ahead and start with some of those because I think we have ample time to do this. So any questions you want from the question board, please send them in. I'm going to start with this one that came in pretty early on. And the gentleman said, is there any noise? I like that term, around the increasing or decreasing of federally sponsored grants for research, because that certainly has an impact where the feds can have a major impact on our institutions. Anything you're hearing, Terry?
Well, it's yes and no. Research and science is likely to be more popular now than it was in recent years. Having said that, the focus right now is on the pandemic and economic recovery. So to the extent that there's any buzz about research, it's with respect to the National Institutes of Health and the research that they do. That's good news for college universities because a substantial majority of NIH funding will be spent at research centers located at colleges and universities. Whether or not we will see rapid changes in other areas of federally funded research, think energy, think National Science Foundation, think agriculture, think DOD, remains to be seen. Certainly the Biden administration has made some pretty aggressive promises, but the reality of finding the money to do that is going to be a bigger challenge. We are relatively confident of getting a significant increase in funding for college and universities as part of the next COVID supplemental to help institutions and students. We have asked for money to help address the changes, the destruction of the research enterprise, but we're not sure that we're going to get that money, with the exception of funding for the National Institutes of Health. It's not a terribly easy case to make, even with a political party that is willing to invest in science and scientific research. We have our work cut out for us on that one.
Yes, I think we do, and I don't disagree with that. For folks that may be asking, the slides will be available, and this is recorded, so please don't worry about that. So I had another question, and it was around, I think, Ian, you asked this question: how much of the increased cost of higher education can or should be credited to increase campus amenities that aren't directly tied to the educational process? So this is an interesting one that you and I might both try to field. Things like fitness centers and single occupancy rooms come to mind. We have a lot of changes in that arena. So would you like to take a stab at this one, Terry?
Sure. Well, there's no doubt that the college campus today doesn't bear much resemblance to the college campus that many of us attended years ago. Certainly the public wants and expects a different level of services than were available at the time, whether it's very nice rec centers or very nice dormitories, high quality meal service, etc. There is clearly some of that going on. Having said that, there are an awful lot of institutions like community colleges that don't have rec centers, that don't have fancy dorms, don't have fancy dining halls, and that are simply seeing tuition increases because operating support has been going down. And at the end of the day, I think the people who want to criticize higher education, it's easy to point to the rec centers and the other things. And as I've said, there's no question that people are doing that. There has been research done, interestingly, I've got a copy of it here in my office, Lander. I'll get it to you. It was done by Nakubo. And what it did was it looked at campuses that invested in facilities like rec centers in particular to see what happened to their applications in the years following the opening of those new facilities. And what they found was that applications in general went way up after schools spent money investing in facilities and amenities. So it's certainly a perception. It is something that I fight against every day. There was one congressional committee meeting last year. Somebody put up a picture of a rec center at a public Southern university and used this to criticize colleges and universities. What the person who put it up didn't mention was that the rec center was authorized by a vote of the students, and it was paid for by students taxing themselves to pay for it. So, yep, it's there. It's a perception. It's a problem. But the financial challenges we face are much deeper than that.
Don't disagree with that. And as you are thinking about the tuition debt and that calculation, is that strictly the tuition, or is it tuition and fees? Because the fees would incorporate the room and board and those kinds of things that we were just mentioning. Maybe a juicy clarification.
The three ways the federal government looks at it. One is tuition. The other is tuition and, well, check that. 3 ways the federal government looks at it. Tuition and fees. Tuition and fees are always combined in the federal data that we use. And the data I was using were just tuition and fees. Because remember, the vast majority of college students don't pay campus room and board charges. So you've got tuition and fees, you've got tuition and fees, room and board, and then finally you've got the total cost of attendance, which is tuition and fees, room and board, books and supplies, transportation, miscellaneous, etc. So there's 3 different numbers. I use tuition and fees because it's the simplest, and again, because the majority of college students don't pay campus room and board charges.
Got it. That makes total sense to me. There is another one about the chart. It said if you were to chart the 5-year wage of college students, would the wage debt ratio change significantly?
5-year wage? You mean the earnings?
Yeah, Ted Widener, you put this in the question board. So if you want to help us clarify that, we will come back to this. So,
or Ted, send an email to Lander, and Lander can forward it to me, and I'll get you an answer.
Yeah, I can do that. So I have another one, and we'll keep moving on this. Does the socioeconomic demographics of our entering freshmen impact the level of debt growth?
It can. The fact of the matter is that as more and more, as institutions serve a population that is increasingly low-income first generation, they have more financial need. If institutions don't have the financial resources to help those students limit borrowing, they borrow more money. So yes, if you serve a low-income student body, you are going to have higher average student debt than institutions that don't serve a low-income student body. That's sad as can be, but it's inescapable. There are a couple of things that we could do to address the student debt issue. A very popular suggestion on Capitol Hill is that we ought to do more counseling of students to discourage them from doing more borrowing. And there is some evidence that very intensive counseling can make a difference. We've seen a decrease in average student debt at Indiana University because they've been doing some very intensive student counseling over the last decade. Average debt has gone down. Having said that, there are an awful lot of students that are relatively indifferent to the counseling. Now, they have to go through the counseling to get their loans. That's required under federal law. So they go through it, they answer the questions, the box gets checked, and they get their loans. So counseling is one possible answer, but it's going to be a very labor intensive step if you want to do it that way. The other thing that we've asked for 20 years is we've asked Congress to give colleges and universities the authority to refuse to certify student eligibility for loans. Student loans are an entitlement to the individual. If I am a Bill Gates's kid and I walk into college and say, I want to take out a student loan, the school is going to certify me as eligible for the student loan. The school has no control over it. Many college universities, particularly community colleges, would like to prohibit some groups of students. Think first semester students, think students taking remedial courses. They'd like to prohibit them from borrowing, but under federal law, we can't. And Congress just simply will not give us that authority. You know, my view, to be perfectly candid, is if somebody's taking in their first semester at community college and they're taking 3 remedial education courses, I'm not sure we ought to let them borrow, because the likelihood of students that start that far behind finishing is pretty modest. So we give them the money, they drop out, they don't have an education, but they have a loan. The response to my thing is to say, look, we ought to let them invest in themselves. We ought to let them take a chance on themselves. And that's a reasonable perspective. But we know statistically that if you need 3 or more remedial courses to go to college, you've got less than a 10% chance of ever completing a degree. Mm-hmm. So it's a tough one. There are no easy answers to it. If there were easy answers to this one, they would have been put in place by now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it is very complicated. In your assessment, are there any regions of the country and or states, maybe in particular, where funding for higher ed has actually increased or stayed relatively the same over the past decade?
Not really. State governments have to fund basically 4 things: elementary, secondary education, prisons and corrections, healthcare, and higher education. And most state budgets are overwhelmingly those 4 things, 85%. Nobody wants to cut funding for prisons or corrections. And indeed, for quite a long time, we as a country were building a lot more prisons and putting a lot more money into corrections. Nobody wants to cut funding for elementary, secondary education. If anything, people think we ought to be spending more money to get better elementary and secondary schools. Healthcare costs are going up in state budgets at 4 or 5% a year. Healthcare costs, if anything, in the current environment, are going to be going up even faster than that because of the devastation the pandemic has wreaked on state and local budgets. So those, you know, it's like playing checkers, except somebody is saying, don't move those 3 pieces. It really limits what state governments can do. They have to balance their budget. So they look at their budget and they say, hey, college, they've got a lot of people that look like paying customers. It's an economic and politically rational step for state governments to take. But over the long term, it's had the effect of leading many states to simply walk away from public higher education. And this means that the cost of going to a public university, particularly a public flagship, particularly if you're out of state, can be extraordinarily high. A friend of mine a couple of years ago had a daughter who had been accepted at UCLA, at Berkeley, and at Princeton. And her mom and I were talking about it, and I said, well, you know, I assume that California is calling. And the mom said, nope, Princeton is a lot cheaper when you look at out-of-state costs at flagship public universities. So public universities have done a lot. They obviously raise prices on out-of-state students. They take more out-of-state students. They want to keep tuition down. I don't know any public university president who really wants to raise public sector tuition, but it has become inevitable.
Got it. So I'm going to ask you this one. It's on the private side. Would you foresee any changes in regulations on private lender interest rates on student loans? Are you seeing that at all?
No, private lender interest rates are set by private lenders. I think that one of the things you might see, and I'm speculating, is with the Consumer Finance Protection Board, that was very active in the Obama administration in trying to protect consumers across the board with respect to loans. With student debt being such a big issue, wouldn't surprise me to see CFPB go after private label loans in higher education more than we saw over the last 4 years. Remember, the Trump administration wanted to kill the Consumer Finance Protection Board. They couldn't do that, so they just sort of starved it. They ignored it. The Biden administration is not going to do that. The Biden administration is going to look to protect consumers, particularly potentially vulnerable consumers, from predatory practices by lenders, not just with respect to student loans, but think payday loans, think credit cards, think mortgages, and so on. It wouldn't surprise me to see some changes in that area driven by federal policy. Okay.
And so I'm back to Ted Widener's question. He said, when a grad has been employed for 5 years, and then he's saying alternatively, 5 years after entering the labor force, does a college grad see wages increase faster than a non-grad?
Oh, sure.
It says yes, for sure, right?
Absolutely. You know, if anything, the long-term economic returns of a college education have increased relative to the returns of a high school diploma. The wage gap between college educated and non-college educated has been growing pretty steadily for a generation. It's particularly the case for people who go to graduate and professional school. The problem is that you have to start repaying student loans right after you leave college. And if you can't get a job, or the job you get doesn't pay much money, or it's not very secure and you have to endure periods of layoffs and furloughs, you can face a financial crisis as a very young person that few people faced a generation ago.
That's really true. And Jeff Pierce, you had mentioned about the state and local nature of colleges and universities versus the federal impact. And I think Terry's spoken to some of that, but you also sort of closed this out with that colleges are struggling to attract students. There is an interest in vocational type programs, and he's mentioning, Terry, is there any movement as far as higher ed to go in that direction? I don't necessarily see that as they're different, but maybe you could chime in on that.
Well, the vast majority of college universities these days are much more sensitive to what happens to their graduates after they leave school than they were in the past. Every college university president knows that the public looks at college, looks at the cost of college, and wants to know whether the students are going to be able to get a job at the end of it. Does it lead to employable skills? So we're seeing more and more institutions trying through different mechanisms to document that they've got some career focus, some career orientation built into their academic programs. Even selective institutions are much more aware of this than they used to be. So I think we're very much going in this direction. Four-year institutions. Two-year schools, of course, have always been occupationally focused. I think that's always been both a strength and a weakness of community college, is that their mission is bifurcated, right? They prepare students to transfer to four-year institutions, so they have a sort of academic mission. They also have a very occupationally focused mission. And in many cases, it's the occupationally focused work at community colleges that's particularly important to local communities. One of the things that's so surprising about enrollment in higher education falling last fall was that when the economy struggles, college enrollments go up. Enrollment in higher education is counter-cyclical. When the economy struggles, people go to college to gain skills, to finish a degree, to make themselves more employable. We would have expected people to enroll in higher education last fall, and instead it fell. It's the first time we've had an economic downturn since the Second World War where enrollment didn't go up. In 2009, remember I was using that talking about the Obama administration. The Great Recession started in the fall of 2008, say October and November. In the fall of 2009, the first academic year after the start of the Great Recession, enrollment in higher education went up by 1 million students, most of that in community colleges. That's not what we're seeing now. Why? Well, we don't really have a good sense on it. There are a lot of hypotheses about vulnerable populations not wanting to leave home, not wanting to go away from home, vulnerable populations not certain what their incomes were going to be when it came time to enroll in the fall. Just a vast uncertainty. We'll get some indication here in another month or two when we see what winter enrollment looks like. And of course, next fall, we will really get the proof of the pudding when we see what happens to enrollments, what students start again. The people that I work with and the people I talk to are particularly focused on the decline in low-income first-generation college students in the fall of 2020. Is that a one-term blip, or is that mean we've plateaued and we're starting to fall in terms of higher education as a vehicle of economic opportunity? We simply don't know. Obviously, in the current world, helping people get a post-secondary education is often the very best possible thing for them in terms of individual economic opportunity. But we got to get them in the door in the first place. So of all the things that have happened during the pandemic, that's one of the most worrisome because it's not clear whether it's short-term or long-term.
That's really true, Terry. And we'll go to close, but I wanted to identify that several people asked questions about the value proposition for sure. And I will come to you offline and we could talk a little bit about that because I think there's a lot that higher ed is doing in that realm and we can do that. Mm-hmm. So I will go to closing since we are at that point. I apologize that we had some technical difficulties in the beginning, but we appreciate and value your time. So please note that there are a number of professional development virtual offerings. Don't forget the member engagement survey that closes late tonight and then late on Monday night. There's an APA FPI Facility Performance Indicator Survey tool that's open and live. We have an app for that, APA 365, so you can get connected 24/7 and ask each other these kinds of questions. And then there's a slide showing a lot of available resources that we have, not only on COVID, but other resources in the website. And I want you to save the date for our next town hall, Friday, February 19, considering the remote hybrid campus workplace. On January 20, 2021, Amanda Gorman, the national youth poet, stole the presidential inaugural show. She reminded me of the beauty and power of poetry. Then it was Gorman's delivery, flowing with tidal grace, accentuated by symphony conductor hand motions that cast a spell in the manner of great music. Her recitation of The Hill We Climb was inspiring. That was one of our students. She emphasized, somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. Our facilities work and support of higher education is never really finished, but by keeping our institutions running, we make a massive difference. Thank you, Terry. We really appreciate your time and energy to this program, and thank you all for the opportunity to serve you. Have a good day and a great weekend.